Every Sunday, I drove to Autumn Oaks Senior Living, a ritual I'd upheld for nearly a decade. It was the only steady anchor in a life otherwise ruled by spreadsheets, market forecasts, and the high-stakes pressure of running a hedge fund. The facility always smelled the same, a sharp, sterile blend of lemon disinfectant and wilted carnations from the lobby vases. As I approached my grandmother's room, 2B, the usual hush was split by a low, tight murmur of agitated voices. Pushing the door open, I froze mid-step. A young woman, striking in a way that felt jarring against the faded floral wallpaper and worn linens of the room, stood by my grandmother's bed. In her hand, she held the jade bracelet my grandmother had worn every day since her wedding day 60 years prior, an heirloom I'd been told 100 times was the only thing she'd never part with. My grandmother was propped up in bed, her face etched with frantic urgency, her frail hands gesturing wildly toward the woman. A hot, blinding rage flooded my veins. I didn't stop to think, I acted. I crossed the room in 3 long strides and snatched the bracelet straight from her grasp. The cool, smooth stone was a sharp shock against my overheated skin. "What do you think you're doing?" My voice was low and razor-sharp, the same tone I used to tear apart underperforming managers in board meetings. I planted myself firmly between her and my grandmother, a self-appointed shield. "Are you preying on the elderly? Is that your game? Are you one of those scammers who swindles vulnerable seniors out of their savings and heirlooms?" The woman's face, which had been set in a mask of focused concentration, crumpled instantly. Shock, then a deep, wounded confusion washed over her features. A bright crimson flush crept up her neck, her eyes going wide and glistening with unshed tears. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Just as I was about to press my attack, my grandmother's thin, breathless voice cut through the thick tension. "Lydia, no. You've got it all wrong." Her roommate, a quiet woman I'd only ever seen asleep in the other bed, spoke up from across the room, her tone sharp with disapproval. "She was helping, dear." The clasp came undone. The bracelet was seconds from falling off and shattering on the floor. I looked from their earnest, unyielding faces back to the woman. She stood frozen in place, her hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists at her sides. My accusation still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Glancing down at the jade bracelet in my hand, I saw it at once. The intricate gold clasp was fully undone, hanging loose and precarious. The full weight of my mistake hit me like a punch to the chest. In 30 seconds flat, I'd built an entire narrative of malice and theft, and it was nothing but a fabrication of my own cynical, distrustful mind. A wave of shame so intense it made my stomach twist washed over me. My face burned hot. I'm so sorry," I stammered, the words feeling clumsy and wholly inadequate. I saw her holding the bracelet, and I just assumed. She finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "It's okay. It's an easy mistake to make in a place like this." She didn't meet my eyes, her gaze fixed firmly on a spot on the wall behind my head. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet, resigned hurt that cut deeper than any shouted accusation ever could. She gave a small, sharp nod to her grandmother, the woman in the second bed, and slipped out of the room without another word, leaving me in a silence heavier than any argument. That humiliating, gut-wrenching encounter became the rocky foundation of our acquaintance. I learned her name was Marissa. Every Sunday, our visits to our grandmothers overlapped. We moved in parallel orbits in the tiny universe of room 2B, our interactions limited to stiff, polite nods and nothing more. I began to watch her, the way a researcher studies a subject they can't quite understand. I'd arrive in my polished sedan, carrying a bag from the city's most upscale gourmet market, filled with expensive organic fruit and artisanal cheeses my grandmother could barely taste. Marissa would step off the city bus, her face often drawn with exhaustion from what I later learned were back-to-back double shifts. She never brought store-bought luxuries. Instead, she came with a thermos of homemade soup that filled the room with warm scents of ginger and healing herbs, or a hand-knitted shawl in soft heather gray wool, made just for her grandmother. She'd sit for hours, patiently untangling knots from her grandmother's half-finished yarn projects, or simply holding her hand, a silent, steady presence. There was a quiet confidence about her, a quiet resilience that both fascinated and unsettled me. A few weeks into our silent Sunday truce, I was at the nursing station settling my grandmother's monthly bill when I overheard Marissa's name. She was in the administrator's office, speaking in a hushed, urgent tone through the half-open door. I caught fragments of the conversation. Payment plan, specialist fees, can't afford another rate increase. My mind, trained for years to spot patterns and predict worst-case outcomes, immediately wove a new theory. It was more sophisticated than my initial, crude assumption of theft, but just as cynical. I told myself her tireless devotion, her quiet kindness to my grandmother even after I'd publicly humiliated her, wasn't genuine altruism. It was a long con. She knew exactly who I was. My family's name was on the brass donor plaque in the lobby, the one that funded the entire West Wing renovation. She was playing the long game, I decided, building a reputation as a saintly, struggling granddaughter, so that when her medical bills became unmanageable, she could turn to me, guilt-tripping me into footing the bill. The logic was cold, airtight, and it let me rebuild the walls I'd felt crack when I realized my mistake. I fortified my defenses, brick by cynical brick. I started to enforce an even more calculated distance. When Marissa offered a hesitant smile in the hallway, I'd return it with a curt nod, my gaze already fixed on the door ahead. One afternoon, she was holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the common room machine, her posture tentative as she stepped toward me. "I got you one," she said, her voice soft. "Figured you could use it after the drive over." I saw the dark circles under her eyes, the faint tightness in her grip that spoke of too much caffeine and not nearly enough sleep. But in my mind, this was it. The opening gambit. The small favor that would later be cashed in for a life-altering sum. "No, thank you," I said, my tone clipped and dismissive. "I don't drink coffee from these machines." The light in her eyes flickered and died. She just nodded, pulling the cup back to her chest. "Okay, of course." She turned without another word and poured the untouched coffee down the drain of a nearby utility sink, the splash of the hot liquid echoing through the quiet hall. I told myself I was being prudent, but a sharp sliver of guilt lodged itself under my ribs, impossible to ignore. Marissa registered my withdrawal immediately. She was far more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. But she didn't push, didn't question, didn't confront. She simply mirrored my distance. She began to time her visits so they barely overlapped with mine, arriving just as I was packing up to leave. Our polite nods were replaced by a deliberate, shared avoidance of eye contact. Yet even then, I noticed things. On days when I was running hours late from emergency board meetings, I'd arrive to find my grandmother's pillows perfectly fluffed, a fresh glass of water set within her reach, or her favorite radio station, tuned to the old jazz channel she loved. The nurses always told me Marissa had done it, no fanfare, no expectation of thanks. These small, anonymous acts of kindness were like pinpricks in my armor of suspicion. They didn't fit in the transactional world I'd built around myself, and they unsettled me to my core. An unexpected crisis with Marissa's grandmother forced us into close, unavoidable proximity. A sudden, severe bacterial infection required an immediate emergency hospital transfer. I arrived for my Sunday visit to find the room in controlled chaos, paramedics moving with quiet, urgent efficiency. Without a second thought, I offered to drive Marissa to the emergency room. Her bus pass wouldn't get her there fast enough, and every second mattered. We sat for hours under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room. We barely spoke, but I watched her. I watched her speak to doctors, her voice steady and clear, using complex medical terms with a familiarity that could only come from months, if not years, of long, hard nights in rooms just like this. I watched her navigate the labyrinth of insurance paperwork with a weary expertise that broke my heart. This wasn't a woman playing a role. This was a warrior fighting a battle I'd never even known existed, with every odds stacked against her. For the first time, a genuine crack split the foundation of my cynical certainty. I didn't see a schemer anymore. I saw a woman just trying to keep her world from falling apart. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon, shattering the sterile calm of my corner office. It was the head nurse from Autumn Oaks, her voice tight with urgent professionalism. My grandmother had suffered a massive acute myocardial infarction. They were rushing her to the university hospital's cardiac ICU, and I needed to get there immediately. The world dissolved into a tunnel of sound and motion. I remember the screech of my chair against the marble floor, the blur of my team's concerned faces, the frantic drive downtown, running every red light I could. My parents were on a cruise in the Mediterranean, completely unreachable. I was the sole emergency contact. I was all she had. I arrived at the cardiac ICU to a whirlwind of chaos, a doctor firing questions I couldn't answer, nurses shouting medical acronyms I didn't understand, the frantic, high-pitched beeping of life support machines. He was talking about emergency surgery, consent forms, a mandatory financial deposit before they could wheel her into the OR. I stood there, paralyzed, my wallet full of black credit cards that suddenly felt useless against the terrifying finality of the situation. My carefully constructed world of order and control had evaporated in an instant, leaving me utterly, terrifyingly alone. As my composure began to crumble completely, a surgeon in blue scrubs stepped toward me. "We're taking her into the OR now," he said, his tone brisk but calm. "We have the signed consent. The deposit has been handled. All we needed was for you to be here." I stared at him, my mind going completely blank. Consent? Deposit? I just got here. My parents are out of the country. It was all taken care of by her other granddaughter. A nurse chimed in, pointing over my shoulder. I turned. There, standing by the waiting room window, was Marissa. Her face was ashen, her clothes the same scrubs and hoodie I'd seen her in on Sunday, but her eyes were steady. She looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in her gaze, then turned her attention back to the hallway where they'd just wheeled my grandmother away. She'd been there. When the code was called, when the chaos erupted, she'd been there. And she hadn't just stood by and watched. She'd acted. We sat in the surgical waiting room for what felt like an eternity, a sterile, beige space that reeked of anxiety and stale coffee. Hours blurred together. I was numb, adrift in a sea of guilt and confusion, replaying every cold, dismissive thing I'd ever said to her, every cruel assumption I'd made. It didn't make sense. None of it did. The truth came not from her, but from a chatty nurse on her break. "You're so lucky your cousin was here," she said, mistaking our relationship. She didn't hesitate for a single second. "That deposit for the emergency angioplasty is no small sum." She put the whole thing on her debit card. Wiped out her entire savings, from what I heard. She said it was earmarked for her own grandma's surgery next month, but that yours couldn't wait. The nurse's words hit me like a physical blow. The money. The same money I'd overheard her begging the administrator for a payment plan for, the same money I'd woven into a cruel narrative of manipulation and deceit, was the exact money she'd used to save my grandmother's life. She'd sacrificed the one thing she'd been fighting tooth and nail for the family member I was supposed to protect. The full, hideous weight of my misjudgment crashed down on me, and I had to grip the edge of my chair to keep from collapsing. I looked over at her, asleep in the hard plastic chair across the room, her face soft and vulnerable in the dim light. She wasn't a schemer. She was a savior. And I treated her like a villain. The next 72 hours were a non-stop vigil. We didn't leave the hospital. We survived on bitter vending machine coffee and stale crackers. We took turns speaking with doctors, decoding complex medical jargon, and watching the steady blip of the heart monitor through the ICU window. In the crucible of that shared crisis, the last of my cynical defenses melted away completely. We started to talk. Not about the monumental things she'd done, not about my endless apologies, but about small, ordinary things. Our grandmother's favorite childhood stories, the terrible part-time jobs we'd worked in college, our shared hatred of the cold, sterile sterility of hospitals. I learned she was a freelance graphic designer, working 2 part-time barista jobs just to cover her grandmother's medical bills. I learned she'd been studying my grandmother's EKG charts in her free time, noticing subtle abnormalities the overworked nursing staff had missed, and had already flagged her concerns with a cardiologist she knew. Her quiet foresight, born of endless love and fear, had likely saved my grandmother's life long before the heart attack even happened. We didn't need grand, dramatic pronouncements. Our bond was forged in the quiet spaces, in the shared blanket we draped over our legs during the long night watches, in the steady hand I'd rest on her arm when a doctor approached with a grim face, in the silent way we'd bring each other water when the other couldn't summon the energy to stand. When my grandmother was finally moved to a regular room, stable, and on the road to recovery, the first thing I did was try to repay Marissa. I wrote a check for an amount 10 times what she'd spent on the deposit, my hand unsteady as I slid it across the table in the hospital cafeteria. She looked at the check, then back at me. She didn't reach for it, not even for a second. "I can't take this, Lydia," she said, her voice quiet but unshakably firm. "Please," I insisted, my voice thick with tears and emotion. "You have to. It's the very least I can do. For your grandmother's surgery. For everything. We'll figure something out for her," she said, pushing the check gently back across the table toward me. "I didn't do it for the money. I did it because your grandmother was in trouble, and you weren't there yet. I did it because no one should have to go through something like that alone. Her refusal was the final, definitive collapse of the worldview I'd carried my entire life. I'd spent decades believing that everything had a price, that every kind act was a transaction, that vulnerability was a weakness to be exploited. But her sacrifice wasn't a debt to be repaid with money. It was a debt of the heart, and I realized with perfect clarity that the only way to honor it was to change the way I saw the world, and the way I valued the people in it. The aftermath of the crisis redefined us completely. We were no longer two strangers bound by adjacent nursing home beds. We were a team. I took her grandmother's medical bills and financial statements to my family's wealth manager, and together we found grants, uncovered hidden insurance clauses she'd never known about, and restructured her crippling medical debt. I used my corporate research skills and my connections not as weapons of cynicism, but as tools to help. For the first time in my life, I was using my privilege for something other than my own advancement. We coordinated our visits, tag-teaming care for both our grandmothers. She'd bring her healing homemade soups, and I'd bring my laptop, spending hours on the phone battling with insurance companies to get coverage approved. We pushed their wheelchairs side by side through the nursing home's small garden, sharing stories and laughing until our sides hurt, the sound echoing through a space that had once only held my silent judgment. We'd found a new rhythm, a partnership built from the ashes of my mistakes. The experience lit a fire in me that I'd never felt before. I saw how easily a family could be destroyed by a single medical emergency, how a person like Marissa, so rich in kindness and spirit, could be brought to the brink of ruin by a system that treated healthcare as a luxury for the wealthy. I launched a small foundation, using my connections to organize fundraisers for families at Autumn Oaks and other local senior facilities who were drowning in unexpected medical costs. Marissa was my first board member. We spent our weekends not just with our grandmothers, but with other residents who had no family to visit them. We organized movie nights, read-aloud sessions, and simple afternoon teas, bringing small moments of joy to people who'd been forgotten by the world. We brought the warmth and connection that was growing between us, and shared it with everyone we could. We became fixtures at the home, a duo known for bringing comfort, and more importantly, a fierce, unyielding advocacy for the residents who couldn't advocate for themselves. Our friendship had moved far beyond personal support. It had become a shared purpose. A year later, we stood in the garden at Autumn Oaks. We'd helped build it ourselves, turning a neglected patch of dead grass into a vibrant, thriving space filled with lavender, rose bushes, and the wildflowers both our grandmothers had loved. Both women were gone now, having passed peacefully within 3 months of each other. We'd stood by each other through both farewells, two unwavering pillars of support for one another, just as we always had. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming spring flowers.
We didn't need to speak.
The silence between us was no longer heavy with unspoken accusations and mistrust, but filled with an easy, profound understanding. I looked at her, at the quiet strength in her profile as she watched a bee settle on a rose petal. This woman, whom I'd once judged so cruelly, so unfairly, had become the most important person in my life. She'd dismantled my cold, cynical, sterile world, and taught me the true meaning of wealth, not the numbers in my bank account, but the kindness we give to others, the bonds we build, and the love we share without expectation of anything in return. My initial misjudgment had been a fractured, painful beginning, but from it, we'd built a sanctuary, a friendship more resilient than jade, more precious than gold. She'd saved more than my grandmother's life that day in the hospital. She'd saved mine.